Hi, I'm your friendly internet conman, back to review part 2 of Jayne Buxton's book. I reached out to Jayne after episode 1 offering to post any corrections, and here's her reply. I'm not going to throw a single study at you like a child desperate to impress their teacher. There is no single paper that sums up the entirety of the debate. It's a complex issue requiring many papers viewed in context. Hence a book that's 500 pages. That's me done. In my last episode, I zeroed in on the really key studies that have stood the test of time among scientists, like Ancel Keys' 7-country study, which Jayne tried to discredit. Her response reminded me of another dismissal of a debunk by Nina Teicholz, the author of The Big Fat Surprise. When confronted with very credible rebuttals, Nina simply said, "I made some mistakes. Understandable for a book with this many references. Meh." I don't know if Jayne is consciously diverting attention from focusing on landmark studies, or she believes that citing thousands of references is good science. If I could summarize my experience as a grad student in geophysics at Stanford, it was that our professors got us focused on landmark studies that really made a difference, and not to spend too much time on a sea of lesser studies. That feels like the opposite of Jayne's approach. Intentional or not, I believe this tweet is a diversion. I often marvel at the multi-decade frenzy to discredit Ancel Keys, who led the team of scientists who produced what has become one of the most landmark studies in nutrition. I think the cartoonist Gary Larson explained it best with this awesome cartoon. Two deer are standing in the woods chatting, and one has an unfortunate birthmark that looks like a bullseye. His buddy says, "Bummer of a birthmark, Hal. Want to see Ancel Keys paint a bullseye in his chest when he was 94?
As I mentioned at that time anyway, the local diet, and what we thought was a good diet, was largely vegetarian. Fruits and vegetables and fish. Not many fish, actually.
Way to make the beef industry come for you, Ancel. You promoted fish over beef. Part 2 of the book is about food and the planet, and it has 369 references. Wow! Being an obsessive reference checker, I had my work cut out for me. The good news is I recognize most of the people she referenced, but what struck me is how different our trust levels were for most of them. I mapped it out to see if I could make some sense of it. For example, she has great trust in Frank Mitloehner, a professor from UC Davis who works on improving animal agriculture. I have mixed emotions about him. She and I both think very highly of Myles Allen, a climate scientist at Oxford, but she has very little trust in other Oxford climate scientists, and it's the reverse for me. I formed a hypothesis. The people she trusts work in animal agriculture, and I'm drawn to climate scientists. But if I'm right about that, how to explain climate scientists like Myles Allen we both trust? This episode has 3 sections for the 3 most important chapters. Part 1, CO2 and methane. Jayne quotes Oxford professor Myles Allen.
He's an esteemed scientist here at University of Oxford. And he has said that eliminating methane from livestock would have an absolutely minimal effect on global temperatures.
Myles is an esteemed scientist, but he's easy to misunderstand and take out of context. For example, Frédéric Leroy, a scientist high on Jayne's trust list and lower on mine, tweeted, quoting Myles Allen, "Eliminating methane emissions from global livestock farming entirely would shave a few hundredths of a degree off global temperature in 20 years' time. Meanwhile, CO2 from fossil fuels is driving up global temperatures by 0.2 of a degree per decade." He got that from an interview Myles did with Farming Independent magazine, which is the one quote you could read without paying for a subscription. I don't know if Frédéric bought a subscription like I did to see the context, but it was confusing because Myles also had quotes like this. Even though an established ruminant herd or rice paddy isn't causing nearly as much global warming as the conventional carbon footprint calculators suggest it is, its existence provides an opportunity because cutting methane emissions can actually reduce global temperatures, just like planting trees to take CO2 back out of the atmosphere. I don't know how to square those 2 quotes, but maybe we should hear from Myles himself instead of hanging our hats on a reporter from Farming Independent.
Well, it's very important to start off by saying that actually cattle do have a huge impact on our climate. The growth of ruminant agriculture over the past century and continued growth of ruminant agriculture around the world has actually had a huge warming impact on our climate. So methane emissions in total, that's not all from agriculture, a lot of it from energy as well, have contributed almost a third to a half of the warming caused by CO2 so far.
What Myles is saying is methane only stays in the atmosphere for 10 years, but CO2 is forever. So even though it's 28 times more potent than CO2 at first, it fades away. So if your herd was the same size 10 years ago as it is today, it's not contributing new methane to the atmosphere. It's just keeping the level the same. Myles introduced a new way to account for methane's fade factor called GWP star, short for global warming potential with a confusing asterisk on the end. Scientists have never been the masters of naming that marketers are. The world has used GWP 100 for decades. Here's the difference. If you have rising emissions of CO2, the Earth warms exponentially. Scary. Rising emissions of methane causes linear warming because old methane is constantly fading away. In this case, GWP 100 and GWP star predict nearly the same thing. Close enough. But what if emissions occur at a constant rate, the same amount each year? Then CO2 still warms the atmosphere because it still builds up, but methane doesn't. GWP 100 did not predict that, but GWP star does. And if emissions fall, then warming from CO2 continues as CO2 emissions fall, and then it finally flattens once CO2 emissions get to zero. But methane comes out of the atmosphere and it has a cooling effect on the planet. GWP 100 did not predict that, but GWP star nails it. This is from a paper Myles wrote with colleagues. When you hear him say cows in the US and UK are not contributing to increased warming from methane, it's because he knows herd sizes in those countries are not increasing. If only that were true worldwide. You can imagine how the American Cattlemen's Association is all over GWP star and lobbying for its adoption because it lets them say cows are not contributing to warming.
A constant number of cattle producing a constant amount of methane leads to a constant amount of warming. No increased warming from constant cattle herds. Remember that. Remember what the Paris Climate Accord is all about? It's not about net zero carbon or reduce our carbon by so and so much. It is about not increasing warming.
There are a lot of asterisks to that conversation because it's only talking about methane and fixed herd sizes, not other greenhouse gases and other factors like deforestation. We'll get to those. Jayne mentioned that Myles has said,
but if we fail to address the problem of fossil fuel emissions' effect on temperatures, everything else is irrelevant.
Here's what she took that statement to mean.
Now, that to me is the most crystal clear statement of where we need to be focusing our energy environment-wise. It says playing around with what we eat in terms of getting rid of livestock, not getting rid of it, reducing it, is just deck chair rearranging stuff.
Michelle Kane is a scientist who publishes papers on GWP star with Myles, and here's how she explains the context of that statement from Myles.
Ultimately, if we don't fix the CO2 problem of getting CO2 emissions to net zero, then we're going to still have a problem. But that doesn't mean that it wouldn't be helpful in terms of limiting warming to also reduce methane emissions in the short term. So the ultimate goal, really, we need to stop the CO2 emissions, which is essentially permanent because it accumulates in the atmosphere. The quickest impact, if we want to reduce temperatures in the near term, in the next decade or two, methane is one of the only things that we can really do. We know that we can't get to net zero in 20 years. There's no evidence really that that's about to happen. In the world that we're in, that we're not making the progress in terms of decarbonising. I think we emitted more CO2 last year than any other year in human history. So seeing as we're clearly not doing that, I can see why the action on methane could be a smaller task to achieve successfully.
What about the other climate scientists at Oxford Jayne spends so many pages trying to debunk? They are very threatening to the beef industry because they say things like this.
Meat, aquaculture, eggs and dairy use a huge 83% of the world's farmland, create 60% of food's different emissions, despite providing just 37% of our protein, 18% of our calories. So you've got this massive, massive difference in environmental impact and nutrition.
Their papers have appeared in prestigious journals like The Lancet and Nature, and as she began to debunk them, I thought, she's got her work cut out for her. These are very respected scientists, and I know their work well. But I followed her references with an open mind, thinking she must have something very strong. The first one I followed was by an agronomist and farmer who goes by the name Bondevet. That's a blog post on Medium where he has 11 followers and very few reads. In the first paragraph, he claims methane emissions cause no warming at all, misinterpreting Myles Allen's science. To prove how much lower beef's impact would be if we didn't factor in methane, he referenced this chart from Our World in Data, also out of Oxford. Note the methane emissions are grayed out. The thing is, if you believe methane doesn't matter, beef still emits 25 times the greenhouse gases of rice and beans, and 100 times more than most nuts or potatoes. Eating less meat would make a big difference in the short term when we most desperately need it, until we can figure out how to reduce fossil fuel use and remove CO2 from the atmosphere. That is not the way the book represents what the climate scientists actually say. And that brings me to part 2, greedy, thirsty cows. I got a smile from that because it reminded me of the game Hungry, Hungry Hippos.
Hungry, hungry hippos, we're hungry, hungry hippos, we love to feed our face.
Well, hello, Harvey and Emily. Are you guys like hungry, hungry hippos? What if I give you scritches? Oh, you like that? Well, hi, guys. Are you getting tired of grazing this overgrazed pasture? Can I offer you a carrot? Yeah, you'll take the carrot? Yummy, huh? You're a beauty. Oh, it's getting hot and I'm lugging around a camera with a big long lens. Better skedaddle back home. The good news is the large agricultural lobbies no longer deny climate change, and they have new marketing to claim that they're part of the solution.
Sustainability is a buzzword today. But truth be known, farmers and ranchers have been working on sustainability from the beginning.
It's all part of taking care of the soil, and who doesn't want that?
But the dirt on our farms is life-giving material, and it takes very careful care for it to keep it productive. And that's what our farmers do each and every year.
General Mills commissioned the consulting firm Qantas to show how farms like White Oaks Pastures could raise cows on grass, providing a much better life for the cows while sequestering carbon in the soil. It's an awesome story. General Mills uses the Qantas report to market their jerky brand. The report makes the astonishing claim that cows can produce carbon sinks. I couldn't imagine how that arithmetic works when you consider they consume carbon from the grass, put CO2 and methane in the atmosphere, and then their meat is shipped off the farm, pooped out by a human in some city, and sent to a wastewater treatment plant. Wastewater treatment plants use power and generate greenhouse gases. This isn't like the days of Plains Indians and bison, where what happened on the prairie stayed on the prairie. Here's how to do the magic trick. Claim that carbon sequestration in the soil exceeds what the cows generate. The way they do that is by buying farms whose soils are depleted from tilling and spraying. Then White Oaks raises pigs and chicken among the cows in the pasture, merrily spreading their poop. But the thing is, they're buying the feed for the pigs and chickens at the feed store off the farm, thereby replenishing the farm's carbon. The magic trick only works for a few years because once the depleted soil has absorbed as much carbon as it can, it stops absorbing it. There is a less glossy version of the Qantas report published as a peer-reviewed paper by Jason Roundtree, a professor of animal agriculture who contributed to the Qantas report. The paper makes it clear that raising cows like White Oaks Pasture does takes 2.5 times the land of concentrated cattle farms. The world doesn't have 2.5 times the current land used to raise cattle. We have already deforested half the globe to raise livestock, and now we're doing it to the Amazon. They also point out that cows fed grass emit 43% more greenhouse gases than cows in concentrated farms. That's because they grow slower on grass, so they live longer before slaughter. And they belch more when feeding on grass than when eating grain.
Really?
That was rude, sir.
So once the depleted soil stops absorbing carbon after a few years, grass-fed beef is a greenhouse gas disaster. Tara Garnett and her team of scientists at Oxford produced a wonderful report called Grazed and Confused. It goes into much more detail than I just did. But it's a great greenwashing story for General Mills to tell, which the Qantas report encourages. One argument that Jayne makes is it takes cows to regenerate soil. I interviewed farmer Bob Quinn, who has a PhD in plant biology and a wonderful book, who never tills his land, has cover crops but no cows, yet he has a very productive and profitable farm with carbon-rich soils. Jayne and I both admire University of Washington geologist David Montgomery, who, with his biologist wife, wrote 3 wonderful books about regenerative agriculture they call the Dirt Trilogy. The villain in these books is the plow, and the heroes are plants, especially cover crops and a diversity of plants. Livestock and rebuilding the soil is purely optional. I'll link one of his great talks in the description. But tragically, as the New York Times points out, this wonderful story of regenerative agriculture is only practiced by a small percentage of farms.
Here's a quick reminder of what farming actually looks like.
Those practices are only used on about 2 or 3% of American cropland.
I mean, this is just pure propaganda. It's a Marvel movie for agriculture.
Even the Qantas report says that White Oaks is so small at 3,000 acres that it represents 0.1% of General Mills' carbon footprint. The trend is mega farms and huge companies.
The farm boasts a size that is more than double the modern dairy farm and is more than 22 million acres of land in total. The farm also has over 100,000, yes, you read that right, over 100,000 cows are located on this farm.
They don't farm the White Oaks pastureway, partly because land is money and the earth doesn't have enough land to meet the current demand for beef if the cows are eating grass. Credit to Jayne, she does acknowledge the land and water problem from the very first sentence of the Greedy Cow chapter.
This is how the land and water story usually goes. Livestock occupy a lot of land, while delivering a small number of calories, and it takes thousands of kilos of water to produce a single kilo of beef. Much land and water is also used to grow crops that are then fed to the animals.
She's right, and I thought, okay, I can't argue with that. But she came back with an argument about why this is fine.
This is fine.
Livestock might indeed take up 77% of agricultural land, but if it provides almost 40% of our protein, and if that protein is vastly more complete and bioavailable than the protein derived from plant sources, the land devoted to livestock begins to look like an investment, not a waste.
That's a unique investment because part of the return on the investment is a degraded planet. This argument dodges the greenhouse gas issue and takes us back to the question of episode 1, is meat healthy? And sadly, from the last 65 years of the best studies in nutrition, you can make that argument for fish, but not for beef at the amount that we're eating now. And the problem with the argument that plants have incomplete protein that's less bioavailable is it's just so slightly true it's lost in the round-off error. I did an episode about that. The conclusions from this chapter, Jayne's right, beef and dairy take up almost 80% of agricultural land and produce just 18% of calories. And feeding cows grass makes it dramatically worse. Those greedy, thirsty cows. Which brings me to part 3, why a plants-only diet isn't necessarily green. To be honest, I didn't understand this chapter. Several pages go into what's wrong with animal agriculture.
The stench of intensive animal farms signifies everything that's wrong with them. The way the animals are managed, the substances that they are fed, the hormones and other drugs used to stimulate growth, the polluting practices, wasted resources, long-distance transport of live animals, and slaughter practices.
But the book also goes after soy.
Now let's look at soya, a staple of the plant-based diet that the Sacred Cow authors have labeled a horror show to nature.
If the answer is 77% of it is fed to livestock for the intensive animal farms we all agree are horrid, then I agree. If the answer is it's a major driver of deforestation of the Amazon in order to feed livestock, which it is, we also agree. If the answer is much of it is grown using pesticides and chemical fertilizers, we agree again. If the answer is it also kills a lot of little furry creatures, we agree again. But it doesn't have to be this way. Here's a clip from Professor Montgomery, author of the Dirt Trilogy.
But no, David is a commodity corn and soy grower. He grows a lot of other stuff on his farm, but he's selling corn and soybeans. But he's growing things like that daikon radish that would sell for an unspeakable amount at the farmer's market in Seattle. But David grows that to feed the microbes in his soil. He kind of considers himself a bit of a microbe rancher, I think. He walked me through the example of what he's done in this farm, where he's gone no-till for 44 years, ever since he came back from a stint in the Marine Corps in Vietnam. And he's then adopted cover crops and has been diversifying his rotation. His field there behind me has a mix of 10 or so different cover crops in it that he pulled that radish out for me.
I think the only reasonable conclusion from this chapter is to eat less livestock to reduce the runaway demand for soy caused by the runaway demand for beef and pork worldwide. Here's my conclusion from the entire climate section of the book. My starting hypothesis was that the references she trusts are people who work in animal agriculture. But my hypothesis did not completely hold. It's much more accurate to say the references she trusts speak well of beef for whatever reason, because they believe it's healthy, or speaking highly of beef sells books. But the book is also anti-plant and anti-chicken, beef's two biggest competitors. The only climate scientists she spoke highly of were people like Myles Allen, who some people misinterpret as letting cows off the hook. The third and last episode of my review of this book is all about the con men who promote plants. Big religion, big business, global elites. It's quite a conspiracy.
She was scared by a warm winter day. When I was a kid, we enjoyed a warm winter day. It was fun because we didn't see it as a symptom of impending doom. So we enjoyed it the same way you would enjoy sudden weight loss until you find out it's an intestinal parasite.